Welcome to our 15th session, 15th session of the Tech and Innovation Center series, part of the Local Infrastructure Hub. As you join the Zoom and get settled in, I welcome you to share your name, role, and organization in the chat so we have a sense of who's in the room. My name is Tina Walla, and I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer with U.S. Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides pro bono technology support to governments. This series is a part of the Local Infrastructure Hub, which aims to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of the federal infrastructure funding that's enabled by the bipartisan infrastructure law by helping to create competitive, winning results that deliver real results to residents. This session is brought to you by Cornell Tech and U.S. Digital Response, and is supported by our funders, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. Now we're going to go to the next slide and just give a refresher for those of you who attended any of our first 14 sessions, or for those of you who are here for the first time. We want to ground you in what we want to do here as a part of the Tech and Innovation Centers. We aim to inspire local government leaders about the integration of technology that improves city infrastructure. And to do that, we've got 4 key values that guide the series, as shown on this slide. First, we're driven by shared goals. We don't believe in doing technology for technology's sake. Second, we want to design for people. Technology processes and products have to reflect the needs and desires of deeply diverse groups and individuals. We're not all the same. Third, we believe in approaching this work with a commitment to resourcing this work. Not just now in this unique moment where there's a lot of federal funds available, but for the future. We want to think about long-term sustainability, and that includes planning for workforce, policies, and regulation. And last, but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Tech and innovation should deliver solutions that are transparent, secure, reliable, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. Now, on to today's conversation, what we're all here to discuss and learn about. Today, we're focusing on how cities are incorporating new technologies for assessing safety challenges as a part of their Safe Streets and Roads for All grant awards. We're excited about these planning grant awards because they include some really great examples of how technology can be driven to achieve shared goals. See core value number 1. Today, we're going to hear about how cities are deploying new data capture technologies like cameras, drones, and LiDAR to detect near misses and keep our streets and communities safe. I'm really excited for all of you to hear about these experiences straight from your peers in other cities. And I saw a question in the chat, is this going to be recorded? Yes, we are recording, and the recording is going to be available on the Local Infrastructure Hub website following today's session. Now, to get us started, I'm going to invite my partner, Anthony Townsend from Cornell Tech, to ground us in some context for our discussion. Anthony, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tina. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I didn't even recognize that we were at 15, so super excited that we have come this far together over the last year and 3 months. So today, if I could have the next slide, please, Manny. We're going to be talking about technologies for tracking near misses. The whole idea of near misses is, I think, relatively new in transportation planning and road safety, but actually has a long history in workplace safety. And that's what you're looking at here. So a near miss is basically an incident that does not result in collision, injury, or damage. Inside a workplace, a factory, a warehouse, that's often like industrial equipment and workers. And this diagram, what's called Bird's safety triangle, which was developed in industrial workplace safety, really, I think, very clearly illustrates like why reducing near misses is so important to reducing injuries and death, because you start with this sort of large number of unsafe acts, things that people or machines do that may be careless. Those create these incidents where we sort of get very close to having an accident, but it doesn't quite happen, but the risk is very high. Then you get a small number of minor accidents and even smaller number of serious accidents. and then an even smaller number of deaths or fatalities. But the more you can reduce the size of this pyramid at the base, the smaller it's going to be at the pinnacle. And these ratios are actually similar to what we see on roads. So I think it's really important just to understand that fundamentally, this is a approach to reducing risk that will ultimately deliver greater safety. One other key thing to note, unlike all kinds of other road safety statistics that government bodies collect around the country, there is no central database for near misreporting. This is new. This is something that cities are really leading the way on in terms of innovation. Next slide, please. A really good example of like why this is useful and sort of illustrating the volume of data that near miss detection technology can deliver comes from a pilot project, a study that was done in Bellevue, Washington. This was a partnership between a vendor whose name escapes me and Together for Safer Roads, which is an NGO that works with industry on road safety. And this pilot placed 40 different cameras at 40 different intersections around the city, collecting thousands of hours of footage, more than 8 million observations of road users. So that's anything from motor vehicles to cyclists to pedestrians. I'm sure there were some skateboarders thrown in there as well, using the roads. And of that 8 million observations, they detected 20,000 critical conflicts. And that's what's plotted here in this hexagonal cell map. And the more orange the colors are, the higher the number or the higher the frequency in that cell of critical or dangerous interactions. And so what this really does, it provides you some sort of high-level insights about where the concerns are. So two of the really key ones that came out of the study were cyclists were 10 times more likely to be involved in a conflict than motorists. That has a lot to do with visibility, but also the way they move around in intersections. And that speeding motorcyclists actually are probably the highest, largest single source of risks and had more close call crashes than any other type of driver. And so that's something that can be used to design countermeasures and interventions. And you can also see that there are specific locations in this large and complicated intersection, notably in the lower right-hand corner, where there's a lot of problems. And so you get this kind of big picture, big data view, but also very precise, very localized understanding. And there's a link to this study at the bottom, which we'll share out afterwards as well. Next slide. How does this data get collected? There are a whole bunch of different hardware solutions out there or sensor solutions for actually collecting the information about what's going on roads. And we have this framework in this series of sort of the maturity levels of technology, state of the art, which is like what's on the market now, what we know works, and what's been widely tested and validated. And in this case, that's camera-based solutions. So, combining high-resolution, weatherproof outdoor cameras with computer vision algorithms to identify different types of road users and cataloging that. The next generation going forward uses laser scanning, what's called LiDAR. And this is a similar kind of installation. It's a box that sits typically like next to a traffic signal or high up on a pole. And instead of visually scanning the intersection, it's scanning with a laser. This just allows a different kind of data to be collected. It's really better at kind of detecting the shape of objects rather than having to infer it from images, and so provides some other capabilities. But it's newer technology, it's more expensive, and it's still kind of entering the market. So that's what we think of as like the next generation. And then on the horizon, this is stuff that, right now I think is really still in the labs, so to speak. This is a screenshot of an experiment that was done at Northern Florida University. We know of at least one case where a city, Eugene, Oregon, is going to be testing a similar solution. But this is less about the tech for collecting the data and more about using technology to get the camera in a different position, notably like hovering over the intersection. And this actually used a tethered So there was a cable connecting this drone to the ground, both to secure it, but also to transmit data. And it just allows a different perspective that in certain situations may allow for better data collection or more accurate data collection or data collection over a wider area than a camera or a LiDAR based on the ground might be able to see. I think this is just the beginning. The use case for these technologies is being proven out by cities around the country, and I think we're going to see more kinds of technologies put to work on this very important problem. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, we live in a nation of near misses. I think as all of you are probably aware, pedestrian fatalities in the US are at a 40-year high. We're all dealing with a lot of kind of strange behaviors post-pandemic. Cities are changing, people are living and working in different places, and our driving habits are changing. And that's created a lot of risk. What was fascinating when we went through the awards that were announced from last year's cycle of US DOT's Safe Streets and Roads for All, that there was a cluster, about 10 to 12 of the 300 or so planning and demonstration grants had zeroed in on this opportunity to test out, to experiment with, to learn about near miss detection technology and what it could do to help in their road safety planning efforts. And so we're fortunate enough to have 2 of those cities here today, from Bozeman, Montana, as well as Indianapolis, Indiana, and we're going to be learning quite a bit about what they're doing, why they're doing it, challenges they face in absorbing all of this data that these technologies can produce, and how it's going to fit into their countermeasures and interventions going forward. So next slide, please. Just a little bit of information about Safe Streets and Roads for All now for fiscal year 2024, which is open. The award sizes for the planning and demonstration grants go from 100,000 to 10 million. The larger amounts are very much directed towards metropolitan planning organizations. But what's really interesting this year is that you get 3 chances to get it right. There are 3 deadlines, April 4th, May 16th, and August 29th. And you can reapply for each of these 3 rounds, even if you're not selected in an earlier round. These grants are competitive, but I think as you'll hear from the cities that we've invited today, many of these are being funded. I think DOT really wants to level up every community that's ready to do the work, to have a comprehensive road safety plan, and they're willing to step up and support that. There were more than 300 awarded just last year. So this is the URL. I will also provide this afterwards, or you can use the semicode to get to that link. Next slide. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tina to introduce our guests and take us through.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. And before I introduce our speakers, we want to take a moment to ask 3 poll questions. So you'll see those pop up on your screen in just a moment. We just want to get a sense of where you and your communities are at on this issue. So Manny, can I have the poll questions, please? Thank you. So you'll see first question, just wanting to know, where is your city on your Vision Zero journey? Second question, how much do you know about near miss detection? And at this point, we've all heard something about it thanks to Anthony's overview. And the third question, how likely are you to apply for the state Safe Streets and Roads for All program this year? Give you a moment to fill out submit your poll questions. All right, any final responses, get them in. And let's see if we can share results. Excellent. Thank you, Manny. So I'm excited, just based on sort of what we're hearing back from y'all. Nearly half of you haven't started yet on your Vision Zero journey. And that's all good. We're glad you're here because I think you're gonna get a lot of good insight and lessons learned from our two speakers who I'm excited to now introduce. Here we go. All right, so let me warmly welcome our two speakers for today's session. First, joining us from Indianapolis, Indiana, is Ryan Wilhite, Regional Manager with Special Projects and Mobility Integration at Indigo, which is a public transit agency and municipal corporation of Indianapolis. I also am excited to welcome Taylor Lonsdale, City Transportation Engineer from the city of Bozeman, Montana. And as always, I've got some questions I'm going to start out with for our speakers. But again, given how many of you are starting out on your Vision Zero journey, given I saw nearly half are definitely applying for Safe Streets and Roads for All this year, we want your questions to get in the mix. So drop them in the chat as we're starting off with some questions for Ryan and Taylor, and we want to make sure we get to those. So first, Ryan, I want to start with you, and I want to start off with a little moment of celebration. Congratulations on the Safe Streets and Roads for All planning grant that Indigo won this year. This project started with the need to upgrade some of your existing bus stops to be ADA compliant, I believe. I'd love to understand how you got from there to video cameras equipped with AI. Help us understand how you made that leap.
Yeah, thanks. So as Tina was saying, I'm Ryan Wilhite, the Manager of Special Projects and Regional Mobility Integration. It's a long title, which means I'm told that I'm paid less. So just be aware of that. This project started out really actually as part of the Safe Streets for All planning. And so when the regional body was looking at how to pull together a safety action plan, they were looking for projects. And when that comes around, I try to ask our different staff, what would be helpful for us to have. And so as was mentioned, there's data on crashes, but not near miss data. And so you can look at some other crash data, but it can be maybe not as reliable, or it's more difficult to get. So for us, we put some kind of a near miss video analysis in the safety plan. But this is actually the result of a failure. So we applied for a fiscal year 22 implementation grant with the city of Indianapolis. We don't actually, we are not the maintainers of the right of way. We coordinate with our Department of Public Works. We had identified 8 corridors that were high injury network that had bus stops along them that needed ADA upgrades anyway. So we were already going to spend money to upgrade those bus stops. My argument, and I think the executive team's buy-in was, well, we're already going to spend money. Why not use that, leverage it to potentially upgrade even more of the corridor for pedestrians? And so we were able to get buy-in with the city to go in 50-50 on an implementation grant. As I mentioned, it wasn't successful. I mean, I will admit that it was kind of a fun idea, but it was a little bit, it wasn't a normal grant for us in that we were a little bit, we were kind of pushing the boundaries of the NOFO. And so the follow-up was, the city and Indigo said, let's pull back and do a scoping analysis. And then as part of that idea, Indigo submitted a separate grant for the near miss analysis in hopes to be able to bring that data forward to help with any future design work that might happen on these corridors.
That's great. And I would just want to acknowledge like that point you made about, this was born out of, you put it as a failure, but a previous attempt to apply for a grant, you didn't get it. And this is a theme we heard in last month's Tech and Innovation Center series about electric buses. And you applied again. You persisted, right? You tried again, took a different angle to help sort of solve your community's problem. And I think that's sort of a huge thing I just want to flag for everyone on the call. Like, it doesn't always happen You may not get that grant award the first time. That doesn't mean you should stop applying. I think that's a
Yeah,
really, really important lesson.
we have a really a massaged grant process internally that we go through when we're looking at discretionary opportunities. And
Mhm.
it's really trying, we try to make sure that the grant idea is in the capital plan or has been identified as an illustrative project. We
Yep.
try then to match the grant to the NOFO really well. And then we try to be candid with our decision makers about our chances. Safe Streets for All planning grants are a much better chance because they have a lot of money available, and they're really pushing it. So there, to your point, Tina, there's a strategy that we deploy for each grant, and it's different depending on what we've seen in the past and
Mhm.
what the grantor will communicate to us in their NOFO.
Yeah. I just love that because I love that you're taking sort of a bigger picture view and then thinking strategically about how these grant opportunities can fit in. Um, great lesson and insight for all of us to hear. Um, I want to hear a little bit more, Ryan, about the technology you're deploying. And more specifically, how does it reduce sort of the labor or effort involved in gathering and analyzing the data? Particularly would love to hear sort of how does it compare to how you were doing that before?
That's a great question, series of questions maybe. But I will say that we haven't bid it out yet. So some of what I'm saying is what we've seen in other opportunities, not necessarily a specific vendor.
Mhm.
Um, so what we're interested in collecting is video around intersections or bus stops that have either are on the high entry network or have a lot of pedestrian activity or a lot of boardings. And we could do that by buying our own cameras and setting them up and then paying an engineering firm on the back end to analyze them. You could do that anyway. But really, that's kind of what we're going for. We don't want to buy the cameras ourselves because we don't know if this is something that we'll continue to use. So the point of this project is as a pilot for us to understand if this kind of work is something that we should continue to budget for and that we find value in. As I mentioned, we don't actually control the roadways, the design of them, none of that. So we have to coordinate with our city on that front. And so more data that those engineers and their team have to help with the design, the better. So the technology, we hope, right, is at least a 24-hour video analysis of activity around those intersections or bus stops, hopefully collecting several metrics, including pedestrian vehicle conflicts, including travel speeds, including where pedestrians are crossing, including vehicle to vehicle conflicts, a number of different things. And then one of the items that we've seen some vendors do, is to actually have artificial intelligence be able to analyze data on the back end, right? This might have been your intern or your junior engineer who's doing this analysis and counting it while they're watching a show or something. And instead, right, we're going to hopefully artificial intelligence will be able to do that and collect that information and hopefully give us path lines for how people are traveling and where those conflicts are occurring.
Mhm.
So that's generally the technology that we're looking to use. It's not the artificial intelligence part of it is probably the most state-of-the-art part of this project. And what does it replace? It replaces us, I guess, going out and counting. I've done that in the past, not for this agency, but it's not something that is really, it's not the best use of our time.
Yeah. Sounds like it's a good example of where you can leverage technology, in this case AI, to sort of optimize what you're spending your human time and capacity on, and then where you're deploying technology. So that makes a lot of sense. One more question for you, Ryan, before I go to Taylor and Bozeman. So you sort of spoke to, I think you referred to as your massaged grant application process, I think was the term you used. And I think a lot of folks on today's call and just in general in local government, I found it a bit overwhelming to respond to all of the incredible funding opportunities created by the bipartisan infrastructure law, right? Like there's so much, and that's fantastic. And everyone to do it well involves time and effort, right? I would love to hear, how have you and the rest of the Indigo team prioritized the opportunities you go after?
Yeah, normally when this comes up, I have a soapbox I stand on, but I won't this time around.
Get on up. No?
Yeah, so I mean, what I'll say, because I also handle our formula funds, and my opinion when these bills were being passed is that there's some of this that seems like it would have been better in a formula fund for us. We already have bus and bus facility formula funds, and so the administration of that is so much easier in many ways than the discretionary portion of it. But that's a digression. I mean, you're asking, okay, how does our process? How do we prioritize? I think we can probably honestly say that at times we are overwhelmed. So we aren't a large agency, but we understand the value of discretionary grants in trying to move forward either pilot projects or to help defray costs for large capital projects that will allow us to then reallocate local monies to projects like operating dollars or some other project, or reduce a bond. So we have a process where, as I mentioned, we try really hard to work with our ops team to identify projects. And then we keep a calendar of all the discretionary grant opportunities that are available to us that we're eligible for. We also will keep a calendar of what we've applied for in the past. And then we usually have a cadence of meetings with our executive decision makers to have like a one meeting where we're like, this is what it's going to look like this year. And these are the projects that we're thinking of applying for. What do you think? How does it fit within the needs that your team has identified moving forward? And then we've got a process within that, right, where we write the grant, right? We have things that we do. We track the NOFO. We ask for, letters of recommendation or letters of support. We collect data. We debrief, win or lose. We debrief, and then we do it all over again. BIL and IRA provide real great opportunities for entities to be able to make significant capital investments. Some of these feel like they should be regular. It's how do I say this? It's so much easier to budget when you have formula funds than it is with discretionary, and I think that's part of it's part of the challenge. And so the opportunities are great, and we're trying to use them to, like I said, do all those things and reduce local costs so that we can use those monies for operations or for reducing bond. So, I mean, there's more to it than that, obviously. I mean, a lot of this is conversations, just regular conversations, and some of this is saying no because we don't have time. We can't apply. I think there's three of us on kind of our core grants team, and I used to write many of the grants, although that was few comparatively. And now we have somebody who writes most of them in collaboration with myself and another person. And I think on a webinar with DOT, they said that there's like 100 grant opportunities. I don't know out of those how many we're eligible for, but we applied as an agency. We applied for 12, I think. And that's a lot of work. And we don't win them all. We have been pretty successful, but we don't win them all. And so we try to be pretty honest with our decision makers that we're going to lose some, and that there's some that we shouldn't go for.
Yeah. That's really helpful. I want to pull out two pieces of that I just think are just particular gems relevant for today's audience. That last piece about saying no. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to go after a grant. And the point you made a little bit earlier around the value of a debrief. Other folks will refer to this as a retrospective or a retro. Just being able to, after you apply for a grant, regardless of the outcome, taking a step back, getting the team together who worked on it, and asking one another what worked, what didn't work, and what could have been better. Ton of value, particularly given, Ryan, your point about there's a whole lot of these out there. And isn't it just is so smart to learn from each of those experiences to make that next application all the
Yeah,
better. So
and
really
real
appreciate that.
quick, like I'll plug most of the, and DOT's become much more sophisticated in how it administers the grants and to try and reduce, I think, the burden on smaller agencies to apply. We have benefits in having a lot of resources. So, you know, candidly, we have an on-call grant writer. This is not regular for us, but we used money to do that because of the opportunities there. But it's a cost. And for smaller agencies that don't have that, you know, DOT's done a really good job in trying to help the overworked many hat public service, you know, sector employee do things. I want to be clear in the debrief. We actually contact the administrators usually, and they will offer debriefs. And that is something that you should be doing, even though they won't answer everything. They'll give you the ratings, and then you can use that to go back to your team and say, we weren't recommended. It's because, you know, Ryan forgot to submit this form and we weren't eligible, and, you know, do better next time kind of thing. But we really encourage that because you get good information, and you can kind of reflect with the senior leadership about stats, how many applied, how many won. We've had grants where we were recommended and we did not win. We've had grants where we were highly recommended and we did not win. And so it's just dependent on the competitiveness of the grant. So you got to be okay losing.
I think that's a good philosophy for life in general, and just continuing to persist and try. Thank you, Ryan. I wanted Taylor, I want to come to you and invite you to share a bit more about your work in Bozeman. Starting with, you know, Bozeman is a one of the fastest growing communities in the country. We know that growth brings change. And my understanding is that your current road safety efforts got started with some pretty high profile bicycle fatalities. Would love for you to start by grounding us in sort of how did Bozeman get started with this current push? Tell us a little bit about the origins of this work.
Sure. As you mentioned, Bozeman is one of the fastest growing micropolitans in the country. We're seeing exceptional growth rates, and all across the board for the city. That is a major strain on resources. But I think, and then as you mentioned, Tina, the couple of years ago, we had two high profile bicycle fatalities. One was a well-loved high school teacher who was hit on his way to work. And that really brought focus for us back to efforts that we had ongoing in the past with respect to safety planning. The good news for us in Bozeman is that generally our roads are safe. We ranked in the top 25 rankings last year for, you know, sort of safest, lowest rates of serious injury and fatalities. That being said, you know, we are a Vision Zero community, you know, safe systems approach. It was interesting in the poll. I marked, we haven't really started because we haven't done the high injury network analysis yet. You know, we're a relatively small city. We just crossed over 50,000 at the 2020 census. So we're in the process of kicking off our metropolitan planning organization efforts for the region, which this ties into that as well, and the city's efforts here. So I think it was a combination of a lot of these things that really brought us to the need for additional data. And I think that really has been the focus of this as we looked at moving forward with a safety plan, and recognizing that the data side of things is a place where we are light. I mean, we have, you know, basic crash data from our PD. The system that we use is a little hard to get detailed information out of. So that's something that we're working through also. But when we looked at the opportunity with through Safe Streets and Roads for All, and the planning and demonstration opportunity, we really saw the opportunity not only to do a comprehensive safety plan, but to take the next step for us in data collection, and that is, begins to look at red light running and near misses. And so what we did, the approach that we took with our grant was to essentially couch it in the demonstration thing. I think a little bit like Ryan, we want to see what this technology really has to offer for us. The other thing that I will add as context is that we have a number of our principal arterial streets are actually owned and maintained by Montana Department of Transportation. So they control the signals on those routes and a lot of the design and operations of those routes as well. So, this is really a partnership with them as well in looking at how we're going to go about this. We recognize that, while we haven't put the data together to identify our high injury network, we're a small enough community that the intuition tells us where they probably are, and those align fairly well with a number of the state routes. And so I think that's the other piece of this. That's a partnership.
You touched on a couple things, Taylor, just in that sort of framing that I want to follow up on. You talked about sort of the data piece as a side of things. You talked about near miss detection, this partnership with the state, which I think a lot of the folks on today's call can maybe thinking through, how do we partner effectively with sort of other jurisdictions. Let's start with near miss detection. I want to invite you to share a bit more about how that fits into your planning. Where does that fit in your planning? And more specifically, Taylor, what are you going to be testing and why?
Sure. So, the near miss detection, I think fits in. Anthony shared that, the great visual of the pyramid, and that, really, I think has become the next step in identifying locations where we can be proactive with countermeasures instead of, the proverbial wait until something tragic happens, right? We're seeing that this near miss technology, the technology that's coming forward and evolving rapidly with helping us to identify locations where near misses are happening is really takes us into that proactive opportunity. And so I think that's really where we wanted to get to. I think, the other piece of that pyramid, right, is that if you're looking at fatalities, you're looking at a smaller number, right? And so, again, as I mentioned, we're extremely fortunate that, relatively, we have low number of fatalities on our roads. And so I think the opportunity with near misses also comes into giving us a broader data set to begin to look at, right? Identify places where unsafe behavior is happening, and those near misses are the outcome of that, and then be able to think proactively about, hey, we're going to get a bigger data set out of this. And I think that's part of it for me too, is, like I said, I feel extremely grateful to say sometimes if we plot the fatal crashes over the last 5 years, there's sort of randomness to it, right? Or apparent randomness, I should say. And that's, I think, really where we see this near miss technology being able to help us, is to hopefully take that sort of randomness out of what appears to be, spots on a map, and help us to hone in on those places that are that. And I think back to helping us to identify those high injury or potential high injury networks. I think that's the other piece of the near miss.
You spoke, Taylor, about the amount of data that's going to produce. So I want to follow up on that. I also want to put a plug as a reminder for questions that you may have for Ryan and Taylor. Drop them in the chat. I've still got some questions to ask myself, but would love to bring, sort of for our audience, want to bring your voices into the conversation so this can be helpful to you and your communities as you think about sort of applying for these grants and embarking on your Vision Zero journey. So Taylor, you talked about how these systems are going to produce a whole lot of data. I think something that many of the communities on today's call might be thinking about is, okay, how do you process and make sense of all that data? Like, do I have the internal resources to do all of that? Can you share how a small but growing community like Bozeman is approaching that?
I can. We're still figuring it out is the reality of it, right? I think that's part of us is, again, I think similar to Ryan, we haven't, gone out and gone after the technology yet. So that will be part of it is that. And I will say that the other piece of this is that we intend to apply again this year for a follow-up sort of supplement to this planning and demonstration activity grant with the intent of continuing to expand our capacity with data and looking at some of the offerings out there that really bring opportunities to process that data, to house and process data, and allow you to look at it through different lenses at different times, and all of those sorts of things. So I think what I would say is we're still really looking at how are we going to use that. I think, I'm a nerdy engineer and collecting a bunch of data is really exciting, but if I don't know what to do with it or how I'm going to actually use it, it's not super helpful. As exciting as it may be, it's not overly helpful. So I think we're still working through those pieces, but I think that's part of the exciting piece to me is how this is emerging and the number of opportunities in this space that are developing, really almost on a daily basis. I'll go back to a question that you asked Ryan and sort of, what is this technology replacing? And
Yeah.
I think it's actually offering us something that we never had before, right? Unless you stationed someone at the corner of the intersection 24 hours a day,
Yeah.
we never had the opportunity to collect this near miss data before, right? And so these technologies are really offering us something that we never had before, right? We would go out and do an observation for a few hours at an intersection, do peak hour counts, and obviously we have crash data and whatever, but we never have had the opportunity before to essentially have 24/7 monitoring of locations on our transportation network, whether that's bus stops or intersections or mainline sections or whatever it is, to understand what's going on and to be able to layer on top of that, these machine learning techniques and the AI that's involving to really then decipher behavioral aspects out of that, right? And then we get into, okay, what are the countermeasures that we can use to eliminate these unsafe behaviors, reduce the number of near misses with the goal of eliminating serious injury and fatality on our network.
I think that's super helpful. You touched on a number of things there that I think are going to be, or probably resonating deeply with the folks on today's webinar. I also want to flag something that Taylor mentioned was applying for another grant. And so just want to call everyone's attention to the chat. Anthony's dropped a link where you can find more information about planning and demonstration grants from DOT. So I want to encourage everyone, take a look at that and see what might be a good fit for your community. Remember what Ryan said at the beginning, keep trying. You may not get all of them, but keep trying. One question I want to ask for both of you is related to privacy. And, Ryan, you were sharing with us, the just use of cameras and AI, but Taylor, I want to get your thoughts here as well. My background in city government is, I just remember anytime there were cameras or sensors talked about, mentioned in any case, there were flags around privacy, right? There's always a concern when cities start deploying cameras and collecting data. I would love to hear from both of you. What concerns have your teams identified in that regard? And how are you addressing them? Not just with the vendors or, Ryan, to your point, the vendor you might work with soon, but also really importantly, the community. So I'll invite either of you to go first there, but just getting a better sense of concerns that you around privacy that you've identified and how you're working with community to address them.
I guess I'll dive in first, Brian. So I think it's obviously, as you highlighted, a major concern.
Yeah.
Probably 12 years ago, I've been at the city about almost 5 years, but about 12 years ago, the city was looking at deploying red light running cameras. And at that time, the state legislature passed law saying you can't do that. And one of the major reasons was a privacy concern. And so I think that's that has highlighted for us how important this is for our residents and for us. At the same time, I think, as I mentioned before, having the opportunity to think about how do we collect data that's going to give us the safety information that we need while being cognizant of that privacy issue. And I think this again comes around to just to some how the technology is evolving with respect to the ability of this processing to happen on the fly, right? There isn't even necessarily a need to record video in order for the data about near misses and red light running and whatever to be collected. Some of the systems flat out just don't even record video, right? There's a lot of benefits to that. One of them being the privacy issue, right? It's not being recorded. Yes, it is there. It is available to view potentially, but in real time only, and it is not being recorded. I think that's one place where where we're seeing that opportunity to have that communication with residents and say, this is not, we're not looking to have recording. Now, some of the technologies offer snapshot recording of the events, and that is again can be extremely beneficial in understanding that, right? And so I think that's the other piece of this is just remaining that the focus of this, the use of video is on safety, right? And that we're this is not oversight, this is safety data collection, I think is where where we're seeing the opportunity to have that conversation.
That's great. Ryan, how about you? How has Indigo been sort of approaching this?
I mean, I think Taylor hit the nail on the head there. I mean, we actually, I mean, some people know and some people don't know. We have cameras all over our buses, and that's for safety. We actually did a whole different project that was looking at how well people were complying with our red MMA lanes, because we have bus only lanes, and so we did a whole project on that. That was. It's not about ticketing anybody. It's not about following anybody. You don't track anything. All we did was just look to see, is there a vehicle in the lane? So I think, a lot of, those issues that may pertain to privacy will work out with the vendor as we're going through the process and ensuring that we're handling the videos and the recordings appropriately according to our internal. But we are in the similar boat as Montana, in that Indiana has outlawed the use of cameras. I think it's cameras for traffic enforcement, but they are experimenting more with it because we have experienced a real return to high rates of speed, and it's causing a lot of crashes, and many of them are fatal. And so there's been a real push, I think, to kind of thaw the idea of cameras being so intrusive. They're a safety tool, and frankly, with some of the challenges with enforcement, they're one of the better ones that the DOTs may have at this point without significant redesign of thousands of lane miles of roadway. So I think cameras have for the last 20 years been pretty controversial in enforcement in cities and states across, but there's been a lot of high profile incidents, and I think a lot of people are asking questions about why we can't use some of this technology to try and improve safety. In Indiana, we had a problem where some school kids were hit by a car going around a bus, and they had cameras on the arm, I believe, but they don't have the ability to actually enforce that part of it, from what I understand. So there's been a lot of those types of incidents where, man, maybe we should revisit that technology tool.
Yeah. I think what you both have touched on is that there's a bit of a tension here. there's value that these provide. There are some privacy considerations, and I think across the country and communities across the country, it sounds like that's showing up in different ways. But really appreciate sort of these, how y'all are both approaching it, and just the clarity of like it's not straightforward, and there's a couple different angles to it. I'd love to think, again, I'm going to do one last plug for if there's any questions for the audience. I've got two more. First one is, want to invite you both to share sort of briefly, based on where you're at now, what does the path look like at a high level to go from planning to implementation, right? Like, how do you think about that? Not want to get too far down, but want to hear for folks, particularly who are starting to think about their planning grants. How are both of you thinking about that for your communities?
Real quick, what I'll tell you is please work with as many people as you think in your agency will touch this. We have, not for our agency, but for another agency, we have returned a grant because the grant team applied for it, but nobody in the rest of the agency really knew what it was. And that's where you get danger with grants. It's a good idea, but then you talk to the people that implement and they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. This isn't useful and it's not something to do. So for us right now, we're going through the procurement process. So we'll talk with our legal team and our procurement team to make sure that we've got the right procurement. We'll procure the vendor through the federally and state approved procurement process. And then we will work with the vendor to deploy the cameras, collect the information, and, do all those fun things. I mean, it's a procurement process and a project management process at the tail end of it. But the beginning is you want to make sure that people who are going to either use the data or be in charge of the project know what you're doing.
Yeah. Such an important reminder just around any sort of change that you're managing, but particularly when it comes to something that you want to get to implementation. Get everybody together. Taylor, how about you?
I think I'll echo that. Talking to everybody involved, and for us, that involves working with the Montana Department of Transportation, as I mentioned. A number of the locations that we're wanting to, at least our initial deployment of the technology, will be intersections where they own and maintain the signal. So we, by default, have to be coordinating with them on that. I think that ties into the procurement end as well, right? What we're aiming to do is to procure technology that will work in the vast majority of the signal systems across our network and could, be moved around. I think, collecting data, and I'm going to, for a minute, I saw one of the questions was, which one, planning or demonstration funding, should I apply for near miss technologies? And we took the approach of doing it under the demonstration side. And part of that is demonstrating the technology, right? How is this, what benefit does this bring to us? The other side of it is thought on then being able to demonstrate such things as targeted enforcement, and those kinds of countermeasures, right? As we're also working through the planning activity of developing a comprehensive safety plan, what are the countermeasures that we want to do once we've identified these locations with this new to us technology? How are we going to address that in our safety plan with countermeasures? So I think that's the other part of this, with respect to getting toward implementation, right? Then is going to be, coordinating with PD. But I think, again, even before, working through the application process was, make sure that if you get this awarded, you have a plan, and everybody who needs to implement it is aware of your plan for that is a big piece of that. So,
yeah. Well, and that, my last question for both of you, which is a question I've asked every speaker in this series. It may be redundant from that last, what you both just shared about talk to everyone. I'm still going to ask you regardless. What is one piece of practical advice that you have for other cities on today's call? Ryan, let me start with you.
Oh gosh, it's a great question. Try not to invent projects to match grants.
Can you say that again? I accidentally spoke over you. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say try not to invent projects to match grants. I think that's where you get into awkward situations in the back end, and then 3 years later, you've got to hand it back, and it's awkward for everybody. So, like I said, we work really hard to try on the front end to identify projects and then match them to grants later. So sometimes those grant projects have been in people's brains and they never tell us, but we try not to just invent something. We try, to Taylor's point, we want it to be useful. I have a quick story where we have to be within a certain distance of our BRT stations for ADA compliance. And so one of the first tasks I did was create this sheet that trainers had to measure the distance. We had all this data because they did it for days and days and days. And in the end, they were like, I don't think we need it. So, if you're going to measure it, if you're going to do something like this, make sure you know how to use it.
Yeah. Huge advice. That's great. Taylor, one piece of practical advice for cities on today's call.
I think the biggest advice that I have is also, don't try too hard to make a grant fit where it doesn't, or where a project fit a grant that it doesn't fit, right? And to Ryan's point about sort of the debrief, I think really digging in and understanding what the NOFO is asking for, right? What is it that whatever grant you're looking at, whether it's a federal grant or state or some other entity's grant, understand what their interest is, right? And where they want this money to be spent, right? And then figure out if you have projects that fit that also, right? And just I think back to Ryan saying, there are times when you just have to say no, because yes, we can draw the connection of our projects to this grant opportunity, but it's a stretch. And is it therefore really worth the effort, right? I mean, that's a hard decision to make, right? It's right there, and you so clearly see the connection between your project and this grant funding, but you have to be realistic about whether the funding agency sees that connection the same way you do.
Huge. I feel like we need to make t-shirts with that advice on them and get them everybody on today's call. Those are gems. We're going to do 3 quick things. First, Manny, if I can invite you to put up our final poll questions. We want to ask attendees today, first, do you feel more prepared to apply for the Safe Streets and Roads for All program this year? And second, what might prevent you from considering a near-miss detection demonstration in the near future? So I want to give everybody a moment to respond to those poll questions. And while you're doing so, I want to give Ryan and Taylor a big, big thanks. Lots of gratitude for joining us today and sharing your experience and your knowledge. Again, I feel like there were gems that I've been scribbling down, and I know the same is true for others. And finally, I just want to remind everyone to save the date for our next session, which is going to be on Wednesday, April 17th. And we're going to be discussing technology to advance your city's climate plan. So different topic, but still really relevant to the work that a number of you are doing as you assess, to Ryan's point, all the grant opportunities that are out there. We want to bring to you relevant information in terms of how other cities are approaching their city's climate plan and technology to advance it. I think we might have a registration link to drop in the chat for that. But otherwise, thanks for filling out those poll questions. Ryan and Taylor, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences from Indigo and Bozeman. And to Rosalind in the chat, yes, this recording will be available to review, as well as a summary of some of the information that Anthony presented at the start of the call. I'm delighted to see the responses to the first poll question. 80% of you feel more prepared to apply. That's fantastic. That's what we want to see. We want to see you feel good about applying and bringing these resources to your community. With that, I'll wrap us up and say thanks for joining, everyone. We'll see you on April 17th. Take good care.